he was giving a prophecy. He was saying that the Melucha of Tzidkiyahu is going to come to an end at the end of 2 years. So the Gemara explains, Shaharei Navi Omeid Be'eser, he was standing up in the 10th year, Umazhir al Achas Esrei, and he was warning them about the 12th year. Okay, this is the 10th year of the Melucha, the kingdom of Tzidkiyahu, and he was warning them that in the 11th year, everything's going to come to a collapse, and there's going to be a Chorban. So he was telling them that you should buy fields, v'kasav b'sefer v'chasam, and make sure to hold on to those documents. Now, if a chazaka would be established in 2 years, it wouldn't be necessary for him to provide this warning that they have to hold on to a document. In other words, what would have happened would have been that they would have gotten up and they would have bought fields. They will be there for 2 years. They'll establish a chazaka, and even if there's a destruction, even if there's some type of breach that happens, and their documents get lost, they still will be able to own their fields because they have a chazaka. Now, why did he tell them hold on to the documents? The answer is because it would have only been 2 years. And 2 years is not enough to establish a chazaka, and therefore you see clearly that they needed to hold on to the documents beyond 2 years. So clearly, 2 years is not enough for a chazaka. You'd have to have at least 3 years for a chazaka. So we don't really have proof that 3 years is enough. We have proof that 2 years would not have been enough for them to be able to prove that they own the fields or any type of real estate. Amalei Abaya, so Abaya responded to him and said, that's not proof that they need to have 3 years. He's a Navi, he's getting up, he's talking to Klal Yisrael, and he's saying to them, listen, Rabbi Sai, you're not getting your act together, there's going to be a Chorban Bayis, there's going to be chaos, and you spend money on a field. If you want to hold on to your field, Be'ezus Hashem, the Beis Mikdash is going to be rebuilt. After it gets destroyed, you're going to come back in 70 years, and you want to come back to your fields, and you won't be able to do that by virtue of the fact it's not going to be easy. Someone else is going to be living in your field. So you're going to try to use the element of chazaka. It's much harder to get your field back with a chazaka. The best possible way to get your field back is to take out a document and say, look, I bought this field. So if you're a person with foresight, make sure that when you buy a field, sados bekesef yiknu, v'kasav b'sefer v'chasam. Write it down in a shtar and have your shtar, your document, signed and dated and sealed and approved, and like this, you're going to be able to have proof that you own the field. It's not a proof. Who said that just because the Navi was saying something, that was actually a halachic psak, you won't be able to get the field back? Perhaps he's just giving them a good idea. The Gemara actually goes ahead and proves that it must have been the case. Dilo tema achi, if you're not going to say that, when he continues, it still says over here, not hearing anything. I'm not sure if. Dilo tema achi, if you're not going to say that he was just giving them a good idea, banu batim vishavu v'natu ginais v'achlu es piryan maika amar. When he continues and he says, build homes and return. V'natu ginais, plant gardens. V'achlu es piryan, and eat their fruits. Now, what halacha was he telling them? Is he telling them you have to have a garden in your house? Was this like the minimum required landscaping that was required when you bought a house? Or were these zoning laws? The answer is no. He was continuing to give them an Eitzah Tova. He was telling them, listen up guys, it's going to be a long gullus. When you buy a house in Bavel, you're going to have to settle there for a number of decades. So you may as well buy a house, you may as well plant a garden, you may as well have fruits to eat, because the gullus is going to be extensive. So Gemara says, Ella Eitzah Tova Kamash Malan. He was simply giving them good advice. Hachanami, when he was talking to them in our Nevuah about buying properties in Eretz Yisrael, he was giving them an Eitzah Tova. Hachanami Eitzah Tova Kamash Malan. Teda, another raya, the Chsiv, where it says in the Pasuk, Unesatim b'kli cheres l'man yamdu yamim rabim. He was telling people, what should you do with the documents? Put them in an earthenware vessel and close it up like this will stay there for a long time. Now that's definitely not a halachic psak. He was not telling that when you have a document, there's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, you have to go ahead and store it in a earthenware vessel like this will stay there for a long time. That's not something which is a halachic psak, so therefore it must be that he was giving just good advice to the people. We have no halachic proof from here how long is needed for a chazakah. So the Gemara says, Ella Amar Rava, so Rava retracts and says it must be that we have to establish the way the Chachamim know that a chazakah works in 3 years is from the following. So he moves off of bringing halachic proof from a pasuk, and he moves more into the category of a svara. In other words, it's a logical conclusion. Amar Rava, Shata Kamaisa, the first year, Machil Inish. It's reasonable to say that a person would forgive somebody who moves into his field. In other words, it's not necessarily normal, but remember, the term that Rashi used yesterday to describe why a chazakah works is, Ein lecha adam, there's no person who would allow somebody to operate in their own field for 3 years without saying something. So that basically means that it's just totally unreasonable to assume that a person would be able to buy a field, or I should say, a person would be able to move into a field, use the field, and act as an owner of the field for 3 years without the owner protesting. The Gemara is saying it is reasonable to assume that sometimes a person might be a little more forgiving. Maybe the person wasn't using the field. So Shata Kamaisa, the first year, Machil Inish. A person might say, you know what, person moves into my field, I wasn't using it anyway, I don't have much to gain from the field anyway, all right, I'll allow the person to use the field. Tarti Machil. Again, perhaps it's reasonable that a person will move into a field for 2 years and the owner will forgive him and say, it's fine, you can use the field. Tlas lo machil. It's totally unreasonable to assume that for 3 consecutive years, a person moves into someone else's field and the owner just says, no problem. That's just totally unreasonable, and therefore, if a person successfully moves into a field or to a house for 3 years and operates as the owner, there is no way to assume that this person is operating there unless they are the owner of the field. Again, operating there without any protest. Amar le Abaya, Shabai responds and says, Elamiata, if that's the case, Kihadra Ara, after these 3 years, Tihadra lebar mi peri. You would have to say you could return the field without the fruits. In other words, let's just play out the case. A person moves in, he squats. A guy goes on a business trip. And in the times of the Gemara, a business trip wasn't just you get on a plane, go to another country, and spend 2-3 days there and come back. A business trip could take 6 months, it could take a year, it could take a year and a half. So a person goes out of town for a year and a half, and someone else says, you know what, the owner of this field is gone. I saw him get on the ship. He'll be gone for a while. I'm moving in. I'm going to go ahead and plant a crop over here. He goes there. He plants the crop. He's operating peacefully. No one's protesting for a whole year. The guy says, this is great. I found the field, unoccupied territory. I'm going ahead and planting in the field. I'm doing whatever I want in this field. No one's protesting. The guy's out of town. So a year and a half later, the guy comes back, and he looks at his field. He's like, what's going on here? I see a guy moved into my field. He put up a sign with his company logo on it. He's selling fruits and vegetables. He's got a little corn stand in the front and says fresh corn, and he's selling it, and everyone's coming by. This is my field. What's going on over here? So now, he protests, and he says to the guy, get out of the field. Obviously, he wins. It's his property, and the guy has to move out. But now, if we're saying that the logic behind this is that year number 1, a person is mochel, he forgives somebody who moves into his field and operates there without permission. So giving back the land is obvious because this guy who moved in doesn't own the land. But if the person forgives him, he allows him to operate there, then the person should be able to leave with all the fruit. Why? Because the person's mochel. In other words, Rav, if you're correct that it's reasonable that a person would be mochel, would allow a person to use his field without any fee for a whole year, so then why does the person have to actually return the land? Alama Amrab Nachman Hadra Ara Vihadra Peri. He has to actually return all the fruits. So all that corn, all those fresh tomatoes that he's selling on the side of the road, he has to actually give to the owner of the field. Why does he have to give it to the owner of the field? He was mochel him. Alama Rava, no, he misunderstood. Now I just would point out, it's important to make this point now, because if you look in the side of the Gemara, I'm not going through every Rashi over here, but there's a big change that happens right now going forward in Maseches Bava Basra. If you look on the side, it says in the middle of Rashi, you have this line, Ad Kan Pirush Rashi. There's another Girsa which says, Kan Meis Rashi. Right here is where Rashi died. So now, whether or not Rashi died in the middle of writing this Rashi, or for some reason Rashi's Perush became unavailable after this Rashi, the bottom line is we don't have Rashi's Perush on the rest of Maseches Bava Basra. Rashi's grandson, the Rashbam, you see it says, Mikan ve'elech Pirush Rabbeinu Shmuel ben Reb Meir. From here on, throughout the rest of the Masechta, we have the Pirush of Rabbeinu Shmuel ben Reb Meir, that's the Rashbam, and you'll notice that Rashi, what looks like Rashi's, but the Pirush Rashi, which is the Rashbam over here, becomes much more extensive. And I have to tell you, it makes the Amudim look much shorter from a Gemara standpoint, and looks much more complicated from a Mefarshim, a commentary standpoint. But that's really because the Rashbam just writes a little bit more long-handed. The Rashbam, it's actually, they're not long, difficult Rashbams to read. It's just explaining the Gemara. But it comes to show Rashi had a very special gift. And Rashi was able to write clearly and explain the Gemara in a clear way, in a very concise way. It was something which is very unique and very special about Rashi. It's a gift that Rashi had. Now the Rashbam, obviously, he was gifted also, and his Pirush is very easy. It flows very well. It's a very good, he doesn't need my askama, but it's a good Pirush on Shas, and it reads very well, but there's something about Rashi being able to write very shorthanded and very clear as well, which the Rashbam wrote a little bit more longhanded. So it's just important to know from here on in, when we quote the Mefarish on the side of the page, that is the Rashbam and not Rashi anymore. It's actually quite a dramatic thing to see, Rashi died in the middle of writing his Pirush on Maseches Bava Basra. We had other Masechtas also, Nedarim was the Ran, Nazar, we also had the Rashbam, but ultimately we see that, Rashi's in the middle of writing. That was his whole life. His whole life was writing. Now there are those who explain, you can talk to the historians about this, that Rashi actually did write a Pirush in the entire Bava Basra. The problem just was that Rashi kept on refining his Pirush, and every time he refined his Pirush, he took the other one out of print, and he didn't want people to see it anymore. Because again, as we said, Rashi was very concise. Rashi was so careful that his Pirush on Shas should be so perfect. Every word was calculated, and as he went through each iteration of his Pirush on Shas, he went ahead and refined it again. So when Rashi refined it again, he didn't want the previous version to be in print because it wasn't as precise as he wanted it. So those who say that there are Pirushim, which maybe some can get a hold of, on Maseches Bava Basra, but that was not made public because Rashi didn't want this to come out, and therefore his grandson, the Rashbam, took over and wrote the Pirush going forward. But either way, going on in our Gemara, from here on in, it's going to be Rashbam and Tosfos. So now Rava says, I didn't mean to say that he was mochel the first year. Rather, shata kamaisa lo kapid inchi. In other words, a person's not as makbid. So there's a big difference between being makbid and giving away your property. That means that I might allow someone to walk on my lawn or to go take a shortcut through my backyard every now and then. That doesn't mean that I'm giving him my property. There's a big difference between me giving away my property and me saying that I'm not makbid. All right, I'll allow you to go there. So shata kamais the first year, lo kapid inish. There are people who are not so makbid. It's okay. Person moved into my field, wasn't using it anyway. All right, no problem. Tarti the second year, again, low kapid. A person's not going to be so makbid, not going to be so careful. However, tlas, once a person starts making established chazak of being in the field for 3 years, that's when you start saying, excuse me, sir, the first couple of years I was a gentleman, and I didn't come outside chasing you off my property. But the third year, buy your own piece of property. It's time for you to actually make an investment. Tlas kapid. Amalei Abaya. So Abaya responded to him and said, okay, if that's the truth, Elamiata, if that's the case, the first 2 years, a person is not makbid, and the basis of chazaka is that a person is not makbid, what are we going to do about Kagon? Hani de Beibar El Yashiv. These fields that belong to the family named El Yashiv, de kapid afilu aman de chalaf mitzra. What about these people? You know that there are certain people that, like, when you step on their lawn, like all alarms go off, and the person comes running outside, get off my grass. So the Beibar Yashu were very makbid. They didn't want anybody walking on their field. So now, according to your logic, Rava, it would come out that if a person stepped on their lawn and nobody came out to yell at them, immediately they'd have a chazaka. Why? Because they're very makbid. There's no reasonable conclusion that you could draw about a person being even one day on a field that belongs to Beibar Yashiv without them protesting, other than they sold it to them. Because again, you're telling me that the basis of chazaka is that once a person's on a field and the owner is not kicking him off, that must mean that that they must have sold it. So if you have a family who's very makbid on people stepping on their field or walking on their field, a chazaka should be established at the end of one day. So afilu man the chalaf mitzvah did who hachanami del altar have chazaka, telling me that immediately a person will be able to establish a chazaka that they own the field. The Gemara says achite ma'achinami, and if you're going to tell me that indeed that is the halacha, imkei nasat lidvarecha l'shiurim. What you're essentially telling me is that every single piece of property is going to have its own laws, and that's just unreasonable. In other words, the idea is that if your whole svara rava is that once a person's out of the category of what's normal to be makbid on, what's not normal to be makbid on, and you're still there, in other words, if you're still in someone else's field, beyond what's normal for a person to be forgiving, and no one's protesting, that means that you have proof positive that you own the field. Then essentially what you're saying is that it really depends on everyone's property. This guy could establish a chazaka in 1 day, this guy in 6 months, another guy in 2 years, another guy in 4 years, another guy in 6 years. It's just not reasonable. You can't have a Shulchan Aruch that says, depending on a person's personality and the amount of assets that a person owns and how much field he needs to operate every single year, that's going to make a chazaka. We need to have a one-size-fits-all halacha for everybody, and it can't just be that it depends on each particular family's level of hakpada of people moving into their fields. So the Gemara says, Ella, Amar Rava, we're going to have to reword this. Shata kamaisa mizdar inish bishtare. So now we're moving completely off of what a person's personally going to be makbid about, and we're going to now start talking about the normal people of how long it's reasonable to say that people will hold on to a document. This is essentially what we mentioned beforehand. Shata kamaisa mizdar inish bishtare. A regular, average person holds on to a document for the first year. Tarti, again. Tarti utlas mizdar. The second and the third year, again, people hold on to documents for 2 or 3 years. Now, tfei, but after that, lo mizdar. People just generally don't think you have to hold on to proof that something belongs to you. And again, there are people who hold on to receipts. And you go to a receipt, and you get a significant expense. You have your air conditioning fixed, or you have your car repaired. You're going to hold on to that receipt, to that invoice, because just in case something breaks, you want to be able to go back. At a certain point in time, you're no longer holding on to these documents forever. Similarly, when it comes to a person's document that they bought a field, the first year, you're very careful. You're in the field, you're the new owner, people are going to ask you, Shalom Aleichem, welcome to the neighborhood, or you bought a new house, how much did you pay for the house? People don't always have so much good tact, who's asking all kinds of questions. Did you take out a mortgage? Whatever else they're going to be asking. But you're going to want to hold on to the document if the person comes by and says, is it actually yours, or are you just squatting? That happens the first year. Second and third year, people still hold on to it. 4 years in, that's just not top of mind anymore. You're going to have to hold on to the document to prove that you own it. You might put it away, but it's very easy for it to get misplaced, and therefore, chazaka is established off of average behavior that people don't hold on to documents more than 3 years. So the Gemara says, okay, Amalei Abaya, Elamiata, if that's the case, that it's just dependent on how long a person normally holds on to a document, macha shelo b'fanav lo tahavi macha. If the original owner protests your being in the field, not in front of you, that should not be a valid macha. The Amar Le, because he could say to him, if you would have made the protest in front of me, and I would have known that someone is protesting my ownership of the field, I would have held on to it for 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years. The Gemara says no. To Amar Le, no. We said this yesterday. Chavra islay, v'chavrach chavra islay. You don't have to make a macha in front of the person. You can understand it can be overwhelming to go to a person and say, you don't belong here, get out. But you can go to someone else and say, just want everybody to know, I'm coming past this field over here, I see a stranger operating the field, or I'm passing by my house, someone's in my field, I want everybody to know that this guy doesn't belong here. It's much easier to do that. You take out Adim, you pull out a couple neighbors and say, remember I used to be the neighbor? I don't know, I went away for a few days and came back and found someone else living in the house. I'm devising a strategy to get the guy out, but I want you to know I didn't sell him the property. It's not his. He doesn't belong here. And that is sufficient. And guess what? Within 15 minutes, the entire neighborhood will have heard that someone else is squatting in the house, and it's expected that the squatter as well will find out. Okay? And therefore, chazaka, a ma'achab, a protest against the one who moved into the field can happen even if it's not in front of the squatter himself. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna makes the point. Shalosh shanim, the 3 years that we talked about, sha'amru, that we spoke about, hu sha'achlon ritzufos, they have to be done consecutive. So Gemara says, "My kamash mulan tanina." Thank you, Rav Huna. It's actually explicit in the Mishnah. It says, "Kaskasan shalosh shanim liyom." 3 years, day to day. You can't just, at the end of 15 years, come by and say, I put together cumulatively enough time that I've been in the field that it equals up 3 years. It has to be miyom liyom, consecutive. Where it says, no, I would have thought miyom liyom le'afukim mikutos. That means that they have to be 3 solid years, or 3 years, each one is solid. It could be year 1, year 3, and year 5. Who says it has to actually be 1, 2, 3? As long as year 1 is complete, year 2 is complete, year 3 is complete, that should be enough. But who says they have to be 3 consecutive years? Kamashmal, they have to be 3 consecutive years. Amar Rav Chama. Modi Rav Huna agrees, but Astra de Muvri Bagi, in a year where they usually skip a year. In other words, there are some times when it's normal to skip a year of producing. So now in Eretz Yisrael we have Shemitah, which every 7 years the fields lie fallow. There is supposed to be some benefit to the land to skip a year. So in a place where they skip years, Rav Huna would agree that you don't have to be there during that skipped year, because that's not the normal way of plowing. Gemara says, Pshita, of course. That's just not normal. Why would he be expected to operate in a not normal way? The Gemara says, Lo tzricha, I would have thought the ika demuvri, the ika demuvri. We're talking about a case where some people skip and some people don't skip. The high gavra muvra. And this guy elected to skip a year. So you might say, Mao the time I would have thought to say to him, if it's actually yours, you should probably be focusing on making sure that people know that it's yours. You should have been from the people who don't skip a year, because you should be trying to establish your chazaka. Kamash Malan, he actually says what I'm teaching you is that even according to Rav Huna, you can skip a year, and that does not prove that you don't own the field. The Amar Le, you could say to him, Chada ara bekule baga lo matzina linter. He could simply say, it's true. It is the top of my mind for me to be trying to establish a chazaka. In other words, I know I just bought the field, and therefore I have to be here for the first 3 years of operation. And you know what? I would have actually wanted to be here for 3 consecutive years planting, but it's just not financially feasible for me to be the only field in operation in the entire neighborhood, because that means I have to pay the entire security force of the whole field, which is going to run me broke. I'm not going to be able to afford to make a profit that way. In other words, if everyone's fields are operational, so then we get together and say, listen, there's a whole area of fields. We could hire one security team to secure all the fields. We all chip in, and therefore it becomes reasonable. But if I'm now single-handedly responsible for all the security of my field, and I can't get anybody else to chip in because everyone else is on vacation, they're on a sabbatical year, I won't be able to afford it, and therefore it's completely reasonable that he won't plant that year either. V'inami b'hachi nichali ta'avda tfei. He could also say, even if it's feasible, listen, the reality is that fields produce better when they get a year of lying fallow. And I'm in this business to make money. And therefore, I want my field to be as productive as everybody else. Imagine everyone else skips a year. You allow the field time to rejuvenate, and I am planting. So the following year, you know what happens? Everyone else has tremendous produce. And I have weak produce because I didn't actually treat my field properly. So you know what? I'm going to skip a year, even though I'm trying to establish a chazaka, because I want my field to be as productive as possible. Tanan, the Gemara goes on. Chezkas habatim. The first words in our parak are chezkas habatim, a chazaka of a house. Now, up until now, we've been discussing a field. But chezkas habatim v'habatim di'biyamama yadi. During the day, people know who's living in the house. Belelia, lights are out. Nobody's out on the streets. Lo yadi. Nobody knows that you're there. So now you're going to have a problem. According to Rav Huna, you have to have testimony that you're there every single day consecutively throughout the year. But if a person says, you know what, I came by at night and there was no one in the house, you'll never be able to prove you were there at night. Who has Eidim that they're in their house at night? Being in the house at night is a private time. Amar Abaya, man masad batim. Who testifies about someone living in a house? Shivavi, neighbors. Shivavi meidi yadai. Neighbors know everything. This is an important thing to know in life. Everything that happens in your house, assume your neighbors know about it, so be careful about what happens in your house. They know about things that happen during the night, during the day. Your neighbors can say, oh yeah, they're home. I saw they came home. They were wait for Shabbos. They came at 4 o'clock in the morning. They just know everything. People know, and therefore they'll be able to testify. Rava Amar Kigon Da'asi Beitrei Va'amri Anan Agrinan Mine V'Darinan Bei Talas Shnin B'Yamamo Belelia. So Rava has a more reasonable solution. He says, you know what? Who's a typical person? I see Dovi's laughing back there. Dovi's my neighbor. I don't know what he's telling Aryeh about what goes on in my house at night. But either way, Rava says it's not necessarily the neighbors who know everything, but it's the tenant. When you buy a property, the tenant who's living in the house can say, we live here, and we're renting from Ruvain. So we've been there every day, day and night. Amarle, Rav Yemer, Rav Ashi. Hold on a second. How could you rely on tenants to testify that they were living in the house day and night, and that the property belongs to Ruvain or to Shimon? These people are no geya. Why? They're paying rent to Ruvain for 3 years. And now, all of a sudden, Shimon comes by and says, it's my property. So they say, no. It's Ruvain's. We've been here day and night. Now, they know if their testimony is not accepted, there's a new landlord who shows up and says, 3 years of rent, pay up. So therefore their testimony should not be accepted. This is how Dayanim, who are not paying such good attention, paskin. Milo askinan, aren't we talking about going to nakti agar? So they're holding on to the rent. Va'amri, they come to base and say, leman lisvai. Who should we give the rent to? We're here for 3 years. It's time for us to pay rent. Ruvain says I'm the owner. Shimon says I'm the owner. Who do we give the money to? Amar Zutra, the answer is that if they say that they're living there for 3 years, under Ruvain's ownership, they give the money to Ruvain because they're establishing a chazaka that Ruvain actually had the property and used it for 3 years, day and night. Okay, in other words, there's no dispute. They have to pay the rent anyway. The question just is, to whom they pay the rent, that's not considered to be no geya b'eidos. Amar Zutra, v'itayin v'amar, laisu sadi, laisu trei sadi, la sudele, de darbe tlash shni b'yamamu b'lelia, ta'anase taina. So in other words, what he's adding over here is that, generally speaking, when a person asks for edus, we don't actually require a person to bring edus that he's there day and night. In other words, we're trying to figure out in our Gemara if it's reasonable. But generally speaking, we just say, can you bring edus that you were there for 3 years? Now, if the person actually requests Eidim that you're there day and night, we would respect such a request, but we're not going to actually make that claim for you. So Mazutra says, if the owner of the field is a peddler who's constantly traveling, and In other words, it's perfectly reasonable why this person didn't know that someone was living in his house. We, the Beis Din, will actually advance this claim for this person and say, listen, you moved into the house, you claim you bought it, you claim you're living there. Here's the requirement of the edus you have to bring to prove that you lived there. The Afagav Lo Tan, even though this Rochel, this peddler, did not go ahead and make this claim, Tanina Lei, we will make the claim for him. Tanina Lei Anan, we will make the claim for him and require edus that you're there day and night. Rav Huna, who says you have to have consecutive operation inside the field, Bechanusa de Mechuza, Liyamama Avida, Lelelia, Lo Avida. In Chanusa de Mechuza, so if you look at the Rashbam over here, Afagav de boy ritzufas yom v'layla bechanvasa de mechuza chanuyas shemochram ben lechem v'yayin de'itoyin ein choshen l'tanasei. When it comes to a person who rented a storefront, so in such a case, nobody should, or at least nobody should be living in their store day and night. There's a time when you're in the store, there's a time that you're not in the store. The fact that you're not there during the night is no proof of anything. He went home to be with his family, and therefore even if the person says, can you prove to me that you were in this storefront all day and all night, 24 hours a day, for 365 days a year, we'll say, no, he doesn't have to have proof for that because it's just not reasonable. People are not going to be there. Why do Mama Avida, Avida, people are not normally there during the night. Rami Bar Chama, Rav Ukva Bar Chama. So here we have a story. Rabbi Bar Chama and Rav Ukva Bar Chama, they were Zavan Hahu Amasa B'Hadi Adadi. Together, they had like it's not really a nanny share, but they had they shared an Amasa, a servant to go ahead to work for them, to clean their houses, to do whatever they needed. So Mar Ishtamish Barishana Shlishis V'Chamishis. One of them used her services for year 1, 3, and 5. Umar shtamish b'shnei revius v'shishis. The second one used her services for the second, the fourth, and the sixth year. Now nafak ir ilave. Someone came by and said, well, this maidservant that you have over here, what are you doing with her? She belongs to me. I was the one who bought her services. So also the Rava. They came before Rava, and Amar lahu, Rava said to them, my taima avdi suhachi. Why don't you guys do this strange thing where one of you gets her year 1, 3, and 5, the other one gets her 2, 4, and 6? So they responded, there's a kihechit lo techazku adadi. None of us wanted that the other one will establish a chazaka. In other words, imagine Rami uses her for the first 3 years, and then Rav Ukva says, it's time for me to have the maidservant now. And he says, sorry, she's mine. I actually have her for 3 years. I have a chazaka, she's mine, no one complain. So therefore, Ravukah, sorry, you don't get the services. So therefore, they intentionally established this where it's only year 1, 3, and 5. It's like this, no one gets a chazaka. So you said, just like for the two of you guys, there's no chazaka. You've ruined your chazaka for each other, you've ruined your chazaka for everybody else, and therefore you have to return this maidservant to the original owner who's complaining. That's only if they did not write a document that shows that they're sharing this sale. Once you write a document that says the two of us bought this together and we're just going to share it in every other year, then there's going to be people hear about these types of documents, and therefore it's expected that the owner hears that the established use of this maidservant for 3 years, it happens to be 3 years together, but either way that would be fine, there would be a chazaka, and the two of them could put their chazaka together. And the Gemara actually talks about this in greater detail later on in the parak, that you can actually have a sheer chazaka. Amar Rava, Acha kula chutz mi beis Rava. What if a person used an entire field but left out one area, one square area? So the halacha is kana kula chutz mi beis Rava. He owns the whole thing besides for that one area. Why? Because the owner can say the reason why I didn't protest about that one area is because I saw you weren't using it, so I assumed you knew it wasn't yours. That's only if that particular area was usable for planting. If you can't plant on that area, Kani, he will be able to be kone agav ara. He's kone with everything else. In other words, we're not talking about the chazaka which gives him the establishment of kinyan, as we mentioned, but we'll be able to say the reason why he wasn't there is because it's not usable. Since it's not usable, he wasn't there. But the fact he's in the rest of the field does actually show he owns the whole field. Mask of Rabbi Rabbi says, hold on a second. Elamiat, if that's the case, a very rocky field. How is a person going to be able to establish ownership of a rocky field? You can't plant there. How do you do that? You use it another way. Not every field is used to actually plant. You could use this field as a storage house. You spread out your tools there, or you're going to spread out your fruits, which you want it to dry in the sun. But ultimately, if that's the case, if you have a particular part of your field which is not usable for agricultural purposes like planting, use it for something else. Store your lawnmower there. And therefore, if you're not going to be there, you're not going to be able to have proof that you own it. It's a couple more lines. A person came to his friend and he said to him, my boss, what are you doing living in this house? I bought this house from you. You're the seller, I'm the buyer. And I've been here for 3 years. I know you've been here for 3 years. However, I was living in the inner chambers of this house. It's a large house. You occupied the exterior perimeter of the house, but I've been living in the inside. Also, the commander of Nachman, they came for Rav Nachman Amalei, Zil Berora Chilascha. If that's the case, you actually have to prove that you were there for all those years. And Amarava, you know what? Let's stop here, because the Gemara is going to continue tomorrow. So we'll stop here. We'll repeat this Gemara again tomorrow. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you all tomorrow. Mir Tzashem.